Good evening. I'm Hari Srinivasan and Judy Woodruff is away. On the NewsHour tonight, Russian intelligence operations continue to influence U.S. opinion. Then, the history of Boston's long-standing racial problems and how they permeate everyday life there. And the woman leading tap dancing's renaissance talks history, tradition, and how tapping evolves.
So inside of this tradition, which I want to always honor, you have to define yourself and define your voice as authentically yours.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. A record-setting blizzard has blanketed much of the northeastern U.S. in snow, while parts of the Midwest bundled up today for brutal wind chills. John Yang has our report.
The joys of a picturesque white Christmas quickly gave way to the reality of digging out in sub-zero temperatures. Wind chill warnings or advisories were issued in parts of nearly a dozen states from North Dakota to Maine.
It's cold. Cold is cold, and you gotta adjust.
Erie, Pennsylvania recorded its snowiest Christmas day ever. 34 inches of snow. Overnight, another 19 inches on top of that. Farther north, the wintry weather snarled post-holiday travels. Snow-blanketed roadways in Buffalo, New York, making for hazardous whiteout driving conditions. At Boston's Logan International Airport, ice and strong winds caused delays. A JetBlue plane made a treacherous landing there overnight, skidding on an icy runway.
We were straight, and then all of a sudden it started fishtailing, and and it started getting rough.
Passengers were shaken, but no injuries were reported. In Chicago, some braved the freezing temperatures for a little winter fun.
We're very happy that it snowed. It is cold, but when you're skating, it's not so bad.
Others heading back to work were prepared.
I got several layers on, about 3 pairs of socks, boots, gloves, mittens, the works.
Hot coffee?
Yes, plenty of that.
There's no rest for the winter weary. Forecasters say the bitter temperatures across much of the Midwest and Northeast will likely last through the week. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm John Yang.
3 major cities are suing the Department of Defense for failing to report service members who should not be allowed to buy guns. New York City, San Francisco, and Philadelphia filed a federal lawsuit today. The DOD has acknowledged the gunman in last month's Texas church massacre. A former U.S. Air Force member was able to buy several guns after it failed to enter his domestic assault charge into the FBI's background check system. The Justice Department's Inspector General says the agency has systemic problems with how it handles sexual harassment complaints. The Washington Post reported that DOJ employees who acted improperly, including senior officials, often received little punishment. Some were even given bonuses or awards. The agency said it's looking into those issues and will respond to the Inspector General with recommendations. The British Royal Navy said it had to escort a Russian warship through the North Sea as it neared the United Kingdom's territorial waters. The incident happened on Christmas Day amid a recent surge in Russian vessels in that area, including intelligence gathering ships. British officials warned the Russian ships could cut internet cables under the sea to disrupt communications. In Peru, there's new fallout after the pardoning of an ailing former president convicted of corruption and human rights abuses. Hundreds of demonstrators clashed with police overnight in Lima. They held images of people killed in a bloody counterinsurgency campaign led by Alberto Fujimori in the 1990s. Speaking from his hospital bed today, the 79-year-old Fujimori made his first public apology for the crimes.
I
am aware that what resulted during my administration on one hand was well received, but I recognize that on the other hand I have also disappointed other compatriots. To them I ask forgiveness from the bottom of my heart.
Peru's current president, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, granted Fujimori a medical pardon Sunday. He had only served half of his 25-year sentence. Back in this country, retailers had their best holiday shopping season since 2011. A new report out today from MasterCard said year-end retail sales jumped nearly 5% over last year. And on Wall Street, stocks took a downward turn, dragged down by losses in the technology sector. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost nearly 8 points to close at 24,000. 34,746. The Nasdaq fell 23 points, and the S&P 500 slipped nearly 3. Still to come on the NewsHour, Race Matters. The Boston Globe investigates how racism still plagues the city. Does God have a gender? The Church of Sweden moves to stop referring to God as male, and much more. Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election is currently the subject of several investigations. But is Russia still mounting operations in the United States? According to former CIA Deputy Director Michael Morell and former Congressman Mike Rogers, the answer is yes. They write in a Washington Post op-ed that Russia's information operations in the United States continued after the election, and they continue to this day. We get two perspectives on this. Laura Rosenberger directs the Alliance for Securing Democracy, a program of the German Marshall Fund that tracks Russian influence operations. A foreign policy advisor to the most recent Hillary Clinton presidential campaign, Laura also served in the State Department during the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations. John Cipher is a 28-year veteran of the CIA who was based in Moscow in the 1990s. He subsequently oversaw operations against Russian intelligence services. He's now with the consulting firm Crossland. Laura, let me start with you. You've built tools to start tracking these different accounts. What have you found?
Yeah, we've built a tool that's actually tracking a network of Russian-linked Twitter accounts that are pushing divisive content. What we see is that a lot of what the messaging is that these accounts are pushing is really about trying to turn Americans against one another, playing on existing divisions in our society, but trying to pull us to extremes. So it's playing on racial divisions, political divisions, issues like immigration that are politically hot, and really trying to undermine the fabric of our democracy by pulling us apart at the seams.
You know, there's a narrative, before we go further, that's going to say that this is all fake. The administration is going to look at you and say, hey, you were a supporter of Hillary Clinton. This is just part of a grand conspiracy to weaponize the intelligence information against the legitimacy of the president.
You know, what we see is actually a lot of the content that's being pushed has absolutely nothing to do with the president, with any particular political party. We see, in fact, there was a Washington Post article today that talked about a fake persona that the Russians have apparently created that is actually trying to push content on the left and is really trying to insinuate themselves on that side of the political spectrum. This is not an issue that's about party. The intelligence community assessment was unanimous in its conclusion about Russian operations. And I think it's really important that we think about this in terms of how it's actually trying to attack our democracy and really is about, you know, could be turned against any politician at any point in time when the Russians deem, you know, that it's useful for them to attack that person.
John Cipher, Laura started hinting at this at the end here. What did the Russians gain by doing this?
Well, I think part of the problem here is that we tend to look at this through solely a domestic lens. You know, the Trump administration looks at it as some sort of attack against them. But frankly, those of us who have been following the Russians for a long time realize that they're the ones that are consistent here. Their goal all along has been to harm the United States and to sow divisions between the United States and its allies, sow confusion, and hurt democracy. So they've been consistent in what they've been trying to do. I think there was a lot of opportunism for a variety of reasons of why things came together in 2016 in the election that made us think it was about Clinton versus Trump. But in fact, it's about hurting the United States. So it's not surprising at all that they continue to go and continue to do these things. And it's also not surprising because there's been nothing to push back against them to make them stop doing this. It's successful for them. It's an asymmetric form of warfare that's cheap and easy, and it's a zero-sum game for them. Anything that hurts us helps them.
Laura, give me some examples that are not political of how the Russians have been engaged in the conversation in the United States.
So folks may remember, in fact, it's still ongoing, the debate about NFL players kneeling during the national anthem at NFL games. And of course, what the players are protesting, who are kneeling, is about police violence against African Americans, often unarmed African American men. what we've seen is when there was this debate that erupted around those protests and whether it was appropriate. This is a real debate that was happening in American society. These are real issues that Americans are contending with. But these networks that we track actually jumped on that, sought to amplify the debate around it, but I think most importantly, actually injected very hateful, extreme, sometimes conspiratorial content into the conversation. Really trying to use the opportunity of people who were heated and emotional about an issue, were, following other content and other people who were watching these debates happen, agreeing with people who agree with their underlying political views. But then these networks, these information operations were injecting this extreme content into this conversation, really, again, trying to pull people at the seams or sow further division.
So, John Cipher, what happens there? Are we just talking about somebody actively trying to rip apart our fabric of society? Does this cast America or American democracy or free speech in some sort of a negative light to the rest of the world?
Well, in fact, it does. A good active measures campaign is what this covert propaganda, what the Russians call this, is something they've been doing for decades, is not about creating these things out of whole cloth, but finding weaknesses, finding fissures in society, and stoking them and going in there and pushing this. So a lot of this is about our problems, our hyper-partisan nature, and our dysfunction. And the only way we're going to be able to solve these kind of things is look at them as a national security issue, not as a domestic political issue. Work with allies in Europe who've been facing this for a much longer time and have had more success with this. Working with some of the tech companies in a more proactive way. I think the Snowden revelations from a few years ago severed some of that relationship. We need to rebuild those things back here. And then we need to figure about learning more about cyber deterrence and defense. It's something that we've been fighting with for a long time and never really come to terms with how to deal with those issues.
John, staying with you for a second, didn't the Obama administration, as part of the handoff, kind of an 11th hour tactic, say, here are a number of things that the CIA can do, take offensive measures, here are the things that you can do, handed it off to the Trump administration, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding, and there's been some good reporting from the Washington Post and others on this. I think there was a lot of hand-wringing, and frankly, it's understandable. These are very hard issues. Fighting covert propaganda with your own covert propaganda or cyber tools is an issue we haven't had to deal with and don't really know what the ramifications are. How does that play back upon us? But so far, the Obama administration and the Trump administration have not found a way to make it clear to Mr. Putin that there is a price to pay for this. And so as long as there's not a price to pay for him, something that threatens something that he cares about, it's going to continue. So this is a domestic issue, a national security issue that this administration is going to have to deal with for years to come.
All right, John Cipher, Laura Rosenberger, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Race in America permeated much of the news this past year, whether it was the deadly violence in Charlottesville, police shootings, criminal justice, and the tone of our politics, taking a knee in sports, or grappling with race in public memorials and history. Just before the end of the year, a major investigative series looked at the different ways that race is coloring economic, political, and cultural life in Boston. William Brangham gets a sense of that as part of our continuing coverage of Race Matters.
Boston is famous for a lot of great things, but it also has had a reputation as one of the most racist cities in America. That's due in part to horrible images from the 1960s and 70s when white Bostonians violently protested against the desegregation of the city's public schools. Fast forward to this past May, when Red Sox fans hurled repeated racist insults at visiting Baltimore Oriole Adam Jones, prompting widespread criticism and an apology from the team. So does the city deserve this reputation? That's the difficult question that the Boston Globe's Spotlight investigative team set out to answer.
I think Boston is racist.
No.
Short answer, yes.
Yes, there is some racism. People might assume that.
We do have a lot of racism.
Certain people in Boston are racist.
In a new 7-part series, its reporters examined racial disparities in the city's famed universities, its hospitals, even the city's halls of power. The series is called Boston, Racism, Image, Reality. And I'm joined now by one of the reporters on that series, Akilah Johnson. Welcome to the NewsHour.
Thanks for having me.
So the very first line of your series reads, Google the phrase, most racist city, and Boston pops up more than any other place, time and time again. So you guys set out to examine whether or not Boston, in fact, deserves this racist reputation. How do you go about measuring racism?
Well, I mean, you tackle it from a variety of different angles, right? So in addition to anecdotal kind of evidence, the stories that people tell of their lived experience, you begin to kind of look at different data streams that really talk about the disparities in wealth and power in the city. So we're looking at, you know, who sits in the seats of power in corporate boardrooms and college classrooms. We're looking at admittance patterns at hospitals, just kind of a wide variety of things that can really kind of provide some data-driven analysis to this issue.
You said in your series documents, in a lot of those places, in hospitals and schools and boardrooms, just as you describe, that blacks are largely devoid from that pool. And how much of that do you think is because Boston has a relatively small, as a percentage, black population?
You know, demographics was something that we kind of dealt with head on, right? Because a lot of people like to say that demographics are destiny. And in fact, Boston does have a relatively small black population, particularly in the greater Boston area. But when you begin to kind of compare that with some other cities that have smaller black populations, you see that you can't solely pin kind of the lack of political clout to the demographics of the city.
There are so many striking facts in this series, and here's one that I had to read a couple of times to myself just because I couldn't quite take it on board fully. It says, African Americans in Greater Boston have a median net worth of just $8. That means they owe almost as much as the combined value of what they own, be it a car or house or savings. I mean, it is just an eye-popping statistic. And later you compare that to the median income of whites, which is almost $250,000. How do you explain that disparity?
It was so eye-popping, we actually had to write kind of a follow-up sidebar letting people know it wasn't a typo, because so many readers thought that we had, you know, created this egregious error in a series kind of as high profile as this. But, you know, that number comes from a study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston as well as Duke University that was really looking at income disparities and wealth disparities in communities of color. So it was Boston was part of a 5-city study, and of the 5 cities, Boston's African-American community had the lowest median net worth.
You also did an experiment using Craigslist to test racial attitudes in housing. Can you explain how that went and what you found?
So we did a Craigslist study, used and modeled off of a lot of what academics do when they do kind of housing discrimination studies. And so we sent emails with what would traditionally be considered black-sounding names and emails with what would traditionally be considered white-sounding names to different landlords in the area, saying, hey, we want to see this apartment. We saw it listed on Craigslist. Is it available? And then we tracked the various responses that the emails received. And by and large, what we found is that emails with black-sounding names were either ignored, not responded to, or that people were more willing to show apartments to emails to those folks who emailed with white-sounding names.
You described that one of the important things you're talking about, not just all of the different data sets that you compiled, but also the lived experiences of African Americans in Boston. Are there particular stories that stand out to you that seem emblematic of the problem you guys were trying to describe?
I mean, I think one of the stories that kind of stands out is a follow-up story that we actually did that has to do with a picture that we put on the front page that led off the series, and also it's one of the main, it's kind of a centerpiece photo of the day one story, and it has to do with a gentleman at the Red Sox game, when the Red Sox were playing the Yankees. And he is by and large the only black face in that section, which really kind of helps illustrate and represent a sense of isolation that middle class and professional class black folks feel in Boston. One of the common refrains we'd heard is that kind of the higher up the professional ladder you go, the whiter your world becomes.
In fact, you posted a video on your website of a white father describing the experience he had going to Fenway Park with his biracial son.
My son and my father-in-law and I all had tickets to a game at Fenway, and it was for the day after the Adam Jones incident. And a young woman sang the national anthem. She was from Kenya, and when she finished, the white fan on the left-hand side of me leaned over to me and said, she sang too long and she N-worded it up. He used the word. I was like, what did you say? And he repeated what he said, and he said, yeah, that's right, and I stand by it. He was very proud of himself. And so I went and reported it, and they kicked the guy out. First, I was confused why he would say this to me, because it seemed obvious to me that I was there with, my biracial son and my black father-in-law. But then later, as I thought about it, I thought he kind of maybe pointedly did say it to me the night after the whole Jones incident as a way of sort of saying, I can say whatever I want to.
If I had been there, I would have asked, like, are you saying that because they're sitting there? Because I think sometimes throwing people's racism back at them makes them really uncomfortable, and they don't actually, no one wants to be called a racist, and I would assume he wouldn't want to actually say he was a racist.
You could read your series as a fairly damning indictment of the way the structure of the city of Boston is organized, and these patterns that have been going on for decades. What has the reaction been in Boston to this series so far?
Or you could read the series as a mirror that we're holding up for everybody in the city of Boston to look at, including the folks at the Boston Globe who realized it was time for us to kind of take stock in-house of what our diversity issues looked like. And so, by and large, a lot of the feedback that we've received from folks in positions of power is just that the series really kind of made them stop and say, we talk a good game and we've talked about this for years, but we need to do better and we need to do more.
How hopeful are you that that actually will happen?
Now it's time to see where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. And so the goal is to hold people accountable. The community is very engaged and involved, so the hope is that they begin to hold people in positions of power accountable for the promises that they make to improve life within the city's Black community.
It's really a fascinating series. Makila Johnson of the Boston Globe, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Coming up on the NewsHour, America Addicted, a high school for students battling opioid abuse. From the NewsHour bookshelf, the memoir of a young American living in Russia during the 1950s. And New Steps, a dancer showcasing a fresh take on an old art form. But first, as churchgoers in Sweden celebrate this Christmas season, they're also preparing for a major change in the way they worship. The Church of Sweden recently decided its clergy should stop describing God in masculine terms, such as he, and instead use gender-neutral language. This change has divided the country. And as special correspondent Malcolm Brabant reports, it's an issue that will resonate beyond Scandinavia.
The weight of history resonates deeply at Lund Cathedral. Its foundations were laid 900 years ago, making it almost half the age of Christianity itself. Now, the God worshipped here and in thousands of other Lutheran churches is getting a 21st century Swedish upgrade. Cathedral chaplain Lena Sjöstrand.
We have a consciousness about gender questions, which is stronger in our time than it has been before. And of course, that has had an impact on theology and on church life and pastoral reflection. And I think that should have that.
Dina synder är dig förlåtna, i Faderns, Sonens och den heliga Andes.
In 6 months' time, the words, "In the name of the Father, Son and Holy Spirit," used at the start of the service, will disappear from churches which prefer to adopt the gender-neutral phrase of "In God the Trinity's name."
I don't think that God is a big mother or a father sitting up in the sky. I don't think that makes sense. God is something much bigger than this.
But here in Western Sweden, there's a conviction that the new gender-neutral introduction undermines the entire service. This is a traditionally conservative region. Mikael Löfgren will resist pressure from the church hierarchy to replace masculine terms such as Lord and he with less gender-specific language.
You don't play lightly with these things. You don't play lightly with the creed. You don't play lightly with the liturgy of the church. Being part of a tradition means that you come from somewhere. You have a history, and that forms you and makes you what you are. And if you lose contact with your roots, you run the risk of losing your own identity.
This is from where the winds of change are blowing, Uppsala, north of Stockholm, the seat of the Swedish church. Archbishop Andrew Jacqueline is the primate of the Swedish Church and leader of more than 6 million registered Lutherans.
We are not going to give up our tradition, but in the tradition there are all these elements already present. Like Julian of Norwich in the 14th century said, as sure as God is our father, God is our mother. So, I mean, this is not something that's newly invented. It's part of our tradition.
Sweden prides itself on being at the cutting edge of social change, and the desire to use gender-neutral terminology is much stronger here than it is in many other countries. In the past few years, Sweden has introduced a gender-neutral personal pronoun as an alternative to he or she in certain circumstances. The Church insists it won't go that far, but critics fear the new pronoun will be introduced in the future. The Church has also said it won't force priests to drop the traditional language, although the primate has made it clear that the changes are preferable.
I think it's a mistake because you can't fool anybody with this gender-neutral language. You can only fool yourself. You are your own enemy.
Krista Palmblad is an associate professor of practical theology at Lund University in southern Sweden.
If the society, as in Sweden, is so secularized, then the Church should instead sharpen its instrument and be very clear about what the Christian faith is. Otherwise, nobody will, in the end, know what the Church is about.
Palmblad blames increased party political influence within the ruling body, the Synod, for what he believes is a potential disaster.
If the political party are nominating persons for the Synod, then of course they are nominating persons not because of their competence, really, in these matters.
Back in Uppsala, the Church primate insists the changes are based on a genuine interpretation of religious history, not political correctness.
God is beyond our human categories of gender. It's actually already in the prophet Hosea in the 11th chapter, God says, I am God and not human or a man. God is beyond that, and we need help to remind us of that, because due to the restrictions of our brains, we tend to think of God in very human categories. We are not worshipping political correctness. We are worshipping God, the creator of the universe.
So what do Swedes make of changes that challenge a perception of God that has existed for more than 2,000 years?
I think that this community and the whole world has been very male-dominated for a long time. And I think that it's important that the female gender gets more space in all communities all throughout the country and throughout the world.
I'm a very conservative person, so most of it I don't like. I'm used to the old way.
If you do make an image of God, which is typically a problematic thing to do because it's supposed to be also something transcendent, talking about that which you cannot really know. But if you have to make symbols of God, then you should make them in such a way that they are accessible to as many people as possible.
The chaplain of Lund Cathedral believes that the Church's patriarchal nature has had a negative effect on some women.
I've met women who have had this experience that my life is not included in what you're doing in the church. And that is, of course, very sad. And we have to, as we can find other stories in our tradition, we have to broaden it, make it wider, so both male and female could relate to faith.
But these arguments fail to move Pastor Mikael Löfgren.
God being the father means he has a son.
But that's the way that history teaches us, but there's no guarantee that God is male. God could be female.
You could use female imagery referring to God, but the name of the God is what God has revealed. It's the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
In common with more liberal Protestant denominations, the Swedish Church promotes the ordination of women, a trend resisted by the powerful Catholic and Eastern Orthodox faiths. So will these changes spread beyond Sweden? Anders Ellebeck Madsen is the faith editor of Scandinavia's main religious newspaper, The Christian Daily.
30 years ago, if you would have asked me if homosexual weddings would have been possible in 30 years, I would have said absolutely not. So I don't know what will happen in 1 or 2 generations, but right now it's hard for me to see this spreading as fast.
Supporters of the changes claim they're not intended to resurrect declining church attendances. Nevertheless, Sweden has become a testing ground for whether a gender-neutral God attracts worshippers or drives them away. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Malcolm Brabant in Sweden.
This week, we're taking a second look at our own series, America Addicted, about the impact of the opioids crisis. Overall drug use has been down among teenagers, but mortality is rising, and that's leading many to seek out new treatment options for their children. The NewsHour's Pamela Kirkland reported on how one so-called recovery school in Indianapolis is giving new hope to students battling addiction. It's part of our weekly Making the Grade look at education.
I went from using downers, mixing alcohol and Xanax.
Oxys, perps.
And I use uppers like cocaine and
some meth and some heroin.
I just used anything I could possibly use.
Life just went on that downhill spiral, and I let it take me there.
Francie Wilcox and Nick Shirkey are 2 of about 30 students who attend Hope Academy in Indianapolis. All of them have struggled with substance abuse.
Thank you for your participation in today's circle and your willingness to support the community.
Twice a week, their day starts here, in a circle modeled after the teachings of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Everything we've done so far in NA has led us here.
Students lay out their goals.
What can life be like when I'm clean?
Their regrets.
I felt bad for all the things that I'd done to people.
And their sobriety dates.
Celebrating my clean day is July 17th.
Hope Academy is one of nearly 40 recovery schools in the U.S. When it comes to kicking a drug habit, experts say simply being young is a major hurdle. Only half of U.S. treatment centers even accept teenagers. That's why recovery schools like these are becoming increasingly popular.
I get a call probably once a week from somebody saying, hey, I saw your school, we really want to start a school, how did you start that, can you help us?
In 2006, Rochelle Gardner started Hope Academy to help students who have fallen behind because of addiction.
Our young people are pretty normal kids. They got the same issues. They just so happen to have this disease along with it. And we look at it as a disease instead of just a behavioral problem.
Hope is a public charter school, meaning it's tuition-free and must take any student who qualifies. The school is attached to an inpatient treatment facility.
Equals 12 over H.
And traditional subjects like math, English, and history are offered in small classroom settings, alongside a constant emphasis on recovery.
Think about how drugs really did start affecting your life.
Students are randomly drug tested and attend 12-step meetings. They also meet once a week with Brad Trolson.
It's an easy thing to forget that we have control.
He's the school's recovery coach and also in recovery himself. We first met Trolson in June while he was meeting with 17-year-old Francie, who had just relapsed days before at a weekend party.
You start to get into recovery and you literally just sit there and think who am I? What do I even like if I'm not getting high or if I'm not with people that I hang out and get high with? You just don't know what to do with yourself.
Our society, our culture is really, it teaches our kids that drug use and alcohol use is really a deeply ingrained part of being a kid. And a lot of our students have fallen prey to that idea. And to such an extent that they really don't know what the teenage experience is if it doesn't include drugs and alcohol.
Okay.
Francie says she struggled with self-harm and an eating disorder for years. She began drinking in 6th grade because she wanted to feel grown up.
It didn't progress super fast. It just I would drink on the weekend, but eventually it did start to go into smoking and pills and other kind of things.
Before coming to Hope, Francie entered 3 separate residential treatment programs.
Addiction literally starts to control your entire life.
I mean, it was at the point where we would say, I think we're going to have to get used to the idea that we might be burying our daughter.
Francie's mom, Marianne Wilcox, says she and her husband felt scared and helpless. From their home in Savannah, Georgia, they made a difficult decision.
My husband suggested maybe we look into this school in Indianapolis, and we could live here for a couple years till she gets through high school, and then go back to Georgia, because there was nothing anywhere in the southeastern corner really for us to do to get her services.
What's going on in a recovery high school?
That's all too common, says Andy Finch of Vanderbilt University. He's one of the nation's leading experts on recovery schools.
Many places just don't have many adolescent options available, and a lot of times the options that exist might be too costly for a family to afford.
Finch recently authored a report on the effectiveness of recovery schools versus traditional high schools for teenagers who struggled with drug addiction. He found that nearly 60% of students in recovery high schools reported not having relapsed in the 6 months that followed treatment. That compares to just 30% of students in regular high schools.
Teenagers who are struggling with addiction are having to face a lot of peer pressure. They struggled sometimes if they're trying to stop using, to find friends who aren't using, to find adults that know how to handle that and what to do with it. And often the place where they're either finding drugs or finding friends who are using drugs is in their school.
We're making a timeline of your life.
Finch also says that many adults in treatment admit to first using drugs while in high school, meaning this age is crucial to combating lifelong addiction.
High school is hard in general, but it's even harder when you have like this extra weight or extra pressure on your shoulders.
Nick Shirkey spent much of his early childhood in the foster care system, where he says he was abused and neglected. His drug use started at age 12.
At birth, I weighed 1 pound 6 ounces. Was born addicted to methamphetamines. Parents were real bad addicts. They didn't care. They just wanted their next high.
Nick tried a treatment facility but relapsed earlier this year. This is his second attempt at Hope Academy.
Most of our students, they're not just substance users. They come with a lot of trauma. They come with a lot of mental and emotional issues that once they get clean and sober, now those things really start to surface.
In many ways, 18-year-old Ian Lewis represents Hope Academy at its best. He started using drugs in middle school, moving from marijuana and alcohol to prescription opiates and cocaine. After 2 years, Ian graduated in June as co-valedictorian. He's now a freshman studying biology at Indiana-Purdue University in Indianapolis.
If you would have asked me 2 years ago, I probably would have told you that I didn't think I was going to college, but I turned it around after I got into this recovery process.
But Ian says Hope Academy can only do so much.
It's not going to save you if you don't want to be saved. Some of these kids out here, they don't want to stop using, and that's when Hope isn't really effective because they aren't using it.
Sometimes you just forget. You think, well, maybe I can drink, or maybe I can smoke, or maybe if I go to this party, I can use like a little bit of coke if it's like recreationally.
When we visited Francie again in August, she'd relapsed for the second time in 3 months.
It just reminds you that I don't drink and use like other people do. Like, I have no limits, I have no boundaries, I just, whatever I can do, I do, and that's just not a right way of thinking.
But a relapse doesn't mean the end at Hope.
We can't be a no-tolerance school. We have to be accepting, because relapse is part of the disease regardless of how old you are.
Francie has been assigned more focused recovery classes where students complete their coursework one-on-one with their teachers. Her mom, Marianne Wilcox, says she remains hopeful, but she admits these last few months haven't been easy.
I mean, it feels devastating. You know, it's just, you want so much for the whole thing to be over, but it reminds you that it's not, it's forever. And it's something that we will be dealing with forever, and she will be dealing with forever.
As for Francie, she says despite her setbacks, she can't imagine her life without this school. Do you worry what might happen if Hope doesn't work for you?
Yeah, I worry a lot. If I had to be in a regular high school, like I don't think I'd even be alive.
There's been little research into the long-term outcomes for those who attend recovery schools, but for the students here, they still have hope. From Indianapolis, I'm Pamela Kirkland for the PBS NewsHour.
Tomorrow, we continue our series, America Addicted, with story of a doctor's devastating personal loss to opioids. We return to Russia some 40 years after the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1956, the country found itself again in the midst of turmoil and upheaval. That's the focus of Judy Woodruff's latest addition to the NewsHour bookshelf.
The year began with Nikita Khrushchev denouncing Stalin himself, leading to anti-communist uprisings throughout Eastern Europe and raising hopes within Russia. Veteran foreign affairs reporter Marvin Kalb was a young diplomatic attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and had a front row seat in a tumultuous year that foreshadowed the breakup of the Soviet Union some 30 years later. He's written a book about that time, The Year I Was Peter the Great, 1956, Khrushchev, Stalin's ghost, and a young American in Russia. And Marvin Kalb joins me now. Welcome to the NewsHour.
Thank you.
So this is the story, as we say, of what happened at a crucial moment in Russian history, in the history of the Soviet Union. But it's also your first memoir after 15 books you've written. We get a glimpse of who Marvin Kalb is.
It was a fun book to write. I'd never done anything like that in my life. When you write about yourself, it's much more difficult than, as you know, writing about the world or an event. And in Russia at that time, everything was just so exciting. And for me, as a young American there, it was an eye-opening, intoxicating experience. I loved every day of it.
And you had been at Harvard, you were studying for your PhD, you already knew the Russian language, you were studying Russian history. This opportunity came along to put you right smack in the middle of this place that you'd been studying, and you were able to get to know some of the Russian people.
I got to know the Russian people because one of the great advantages of being utterly unimportant at the embassy was that when I wanted to travel to different parts of the Soviet Union, which had up to that moment been closed to foreigners, the ambassador, the wonderful Charles Bolin, looked at me and he would say, "What have I got to lose?" So Marvin would go off to Central Asia, to Ukraine, to northern Russia, everywhere. And after an initial period of caution, the Russian people opened up, at least in my experience. And I had a wonderful time with them. I really was able to hear their problems and understand what was on their minds, in addition to having access to someone like Nikita Khrushchev.
Well, and I want you to tell that story, but we should remind everybody this year was crucial in the history of the Soviet Union because a month or two after you arrived, Nikita Khrushchev surprises everybody and denounces Joseph Stalin, who had been a hero in their eyes, and everything changed, at least for a short time when you were there.
It was a fantastic moment in modern Russian history. Up to that time, the Russian people had never experienced personal freedom. And the Russian people, for the first time in their history, had an opportunity to think for themselves. And it was such a magnificent, fresh, wonderful thought for them and an experience for them that they began to think, wait a minute, maybe we can get freedom. And suddenly, young people, the future of Russia, they're denouncing the system itself. And that thought ran through Russia, then it spilled over the borders and went into Eastern Europe, and suddenly you had the Hungarian Revolution.
Everything was closed up again.
Because Khrushchev decided just to crack down to end that.
But in the meantime, you had the opportunity to meet Khrushchev himself. Tell the story, because that's where the name Peter the Great comes from.
It was the July 4th holiday. Ambassador Bolin was having a big event. Khrushchev decided to come with the entire Politburo. I happened to be one of 4 Americans in a woefully understaffed embassy who spoke Russian. So Ambassador Bolin said, "Marvin, you want to look after Marshal Zhukov." That was sort of crazy in my mind because I had been a PFC in the United States Army. That was my top rank. And here I was responsible for dealing with a Soviet marshal, and he loved vodka. So I fed him vodka, and I drank water.
It's a great story.
I drank water, and after about 8 vodkas and waters, Khrushchev beckoned to both of us to come on over, and Zhukov was a little tipsy, and he said to Khrushchev, "Nikita Sergeyevich, I have finally found a young American who can drink like a Russian." Khrushchev loved that line. He looked up at me and he said, "How tall are you?" I said, "I'm 6 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great." Well, he loved the line. It brought the house down. And from that time, even when I came back years later for CBS, he always remembered me as Peter the Great. It was a great asset.
You had access in a way that no other American journalist had. But Marvin, what did you learn about them as a people?
What I think I learned more than anything else is how similar they are to us. I remember once being in a train with a young Azerbaijani woman, probably 22, 23, and we were traveling together, just happened that way. And she was looking at me and she says, "Where are you from?" I said, "The United States." She said, "I don't believe it." "Why?" "Well, you speak Russian." I said, "Yes, but even an American can learn Russian." And there was an awkward 5 or 10 minutes when things were, the Americans are very bad and this is very bad. And then when she felt she knew me and I felt I was getting to know her, everything sort of dropped, and we were two people, and we were sharing experiences and insights. And I found that to be the case with Russians, whether they lived in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, or Ukraine, Northern Russia. They're people just as we. They really wanted peace. Remember that this was 11 years after the end of World War II. 30 million Russians have been killed in World War II, maybe more. And they all wanted peace, and yet they felt maybe they weren't going to get it. Maybe there'd be war.
Well, it's so many telling stories, a
It's
wonderfully
fun.
written book. The year I was Peter the Great, 1956. Khrushchev, Stalin's Ghost, and a Young American in Russia. Marvin Kalb, thank you.
Thank
very
you,
much.
Judy. Thank you.
Now, how an artist in the world of tap dancing is using tradition, breaking with it, and experimenting with a genre she discovered when she was just 3 years old. Jeffrey Brown profiles a choreographer who's lighting up the stage in New York this holiday season.
For tap dancing phenom Michelle Dorrance, the most important thing you need to know about her art form is this.
You dance to create music. Like tap dance is the dance of creating music.
Is it down by the Russian? That means we, the audience, both watch and listen. And for Dorrance, the sound she seeks guide the movement.
In order to get this sound, I have to move my body this way. So the look of tap dance is often because we needed a hard toe or a heel or a toe drop. And because of those particular nuances, our body had to do this to execute that sound, and that's where the dance comes from. When people say to us, "Oh, I get it, it's music," and you're like, yes, but that's what drives us.
Since founding her company, Dorrance Dance, in 2011, she's helped lead a renaissance in tap, gaining attention for her own exuberant athletic style, arms, head, and feet in motion. She's choreographed full-length dances for her group, including ETM Double Down, where the focus on music is made explicit. As dancers step on wooden boards that function like electronic drum pads. She and the company are constantly touring, bringing new audiences to this tradition-bound dance form. In 2015, Dorrance was recognized with the so-called Genius Award from the MacArthur Foundation.
That was much better on a lot of levels.
And this hoofer is a trooper.
Sorry.
Fighting off a bout of laryngitis, she let us visit a recent rehearsal of a dance called Myelination at a Midtown Manhattan studio, and was happy to talk about her role as an evangelist for tap.
Some people use the word edutain or edutainment.
Yeah, that's what you see yourself doing.
Yeah, I mean, inside of the art form, you must constantly educate about the past. But, I mean, something we were charged with, speaking of tradition, by our masters and our elders of the jazz era, is that's what jazz was about. Having your own individual voice and pushing your expression forward. So inside of this tradition, which I want to always honor, you have to define yourself and define your voice as authentically yours.
Now 38, Dorrance grew up in North Carolina, dancing tap from age 3. She performed with the North Carolina Youth Tap Ensemble and later with the show Stomp. Her mother is a ballet dancer and teacher, founder of the Ballet School of Chapel Hill. Her father, head coach of the University of North Carolina's women's soccer team, and one-time coach of the USA women's team. Somehow tap comes from that?
Yeah, we all joke about it because they both use their feet for their professions. Both of them have incredibly quick feet, so let's...
You got that gene.
Yeah, let's bring that here.
Quick feet are certainly one requirement for tap dancing, but it's also clear that Dorrance seeks diverse styles and personalities for her company. We watched her rehearse a duet with 22-year-old Byron Tittle.
Well, I met Michelle when I was 10 at a tap festival. And I've just been taking her classes and following her, kind of like a stalker, since then. For me, there's a push that Michelle puts under you and behind you that doesn't feel forceful. It feels encouraging. My life was made because Michelle asked me to do something that was crazy. It's full circle. It's really cool.
By contrast, 39-year-old Nicholas Young has known and danced with Dorrance since they were teens. And there's another obvious contrast, size.
That's something that people have been really excited about. The dancers that Michelle chooses, that she chooses a very diverse group of dancers, you know, and she allows each of us to express ourselves individually, while then at times creating a very specific image or a story or a feeling in her pieces. But then I think people really enjoy seeing all of us move out of that storyline and become ourselves. I think people relate. I actually get that a lot. I get guys coming to me after a show and being like, hey, you really made me feel like I could do this too. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, so I don't know.
That's a good feeling.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah.
In her Dance the Blues project, Dorrance directly addressed the role of tradition and history. For her and the other dancers we met, being part of a tradition and knowing that history is intrinsic to their lives in tap. Dorrance cites the recent impact of Savion Glover, whose Bringin' to Noise, Bringin' to Funk, first performed in 1995, was another revolutionary moment for the form. She's also acutely aware, as a white woman, that the history of innovation in tap has come largely from African Americans.
It is a black form, it's an African American form.
Yeah. So how do you think about the racial aspect?
It's really important to acknowledge it, and it's really important to share the history of the form and to say the names of dancers. To say the name Jimmy Slide, Dr. Jimmy Slide, Dr. Buster Brown, to say the names of Faye Art and Harold Nicholas, Charlie Atkins, Honey Coles, to say the names of these men that aren't the first names that come to your mind. You think of a Fred Astaire or Gene Kelly because they were the heroes of the movie musical, but they were dancers behind the scenes. And they were dancers innovating the form that weren't on the screen. But they were the ones that were breathing fire into the form to make it exciting.
And not just men. Dorrance also cites women dancers who've been important to her. Diane Walker, Brenda Buffalino, Mabel Lee.
I feel very lucky to be a tap dancer, especially a woman as a tap dancer right now. I feel like I can jump into or be inspired by the style of a man or a woman, and it doesn't matter. And I won't be received as being something very specific. I'll just be received as a dancer or a musician.
Dorrance Dance performs in New York this holiday season and then resumes touring around the country in January. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown in New York.
Tonight on PBS at 8 Eastern, 7 Central, a new docudrama, The Sultan and the Saint, tells a little-known story of St. Francis of Assisi and the Sultan of Egypt, Malik al-Kamil, who met on a battlefield and found common ground. Here's a preview.
The biggest indication that Francis was changed by his encounter with Sultan al-Kamil is that he rewrote the rule of his order, its code of conduct, its constitution, really, to say to his friars that you can go and live in peace among Muslims.
And that's tonight on PBS. That's the NewsHour for tonight. On Wednesday, we continue our series, America Addicted, and review the year in tech. I'm Hari Srinivasan. Join us online and again here tomorrow evening. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you. See you soon.
You're watching PBS.